On June 12th of 2015, I set out from Chicago determined to ride to the Arctic Ocean and back. It was my first major ride and I decided to go solo, mostly because it's hard to find people with both 6 weeks free and a love of long-distance motorcycling, especially in a city that you just moved to. Another layer to the story is that my wife was newly pregnant with our first child, who was due the following winter. There was never going to be a better time to get on the road. Over the next 3 weeks, I made my way through Yellowstone, Seattle, British Columbia, with a quick stop in Hyder, Alaska, then up the Cassiar Highway north to the Yukon, and finally into Alaska proper, to arrive at the doorstep of the northern wilderness in Fairbanks, Alaska. This film documents the 4 days I spent riding solo to Prudhoe Bay along the famous haul road they call the Dalton Highway. I'm a multidisciplinary artist, an educator, and I also happen to have a penchant for birdwatching to go along with my fascination for motorcycles. I came to bikes pretty late in life, getting my first one about 10 years ago at the ripe old age of 33. This trip had been a goal of mine for some years, so I was really happy to get the chance to do it, and it would not have been possible without the support of my wife, Shireen. She was a passenger in my mind and my heart over each one of the 12,235 miles of the trip. All right, let's start the show. It's morning. I'm heading north from Fairbanks toward the start of the Dalton. You have about an hour to think about what lies ahead as you cover the 80 or so miles and approach the intersection which marks the start of the haul road. Even getting this far felt like a huge achievement. I kept thinking about everything I'd read about the dangers of this road, about the conflicting stories of both easygoing and horrendous conditions, about the risks and joys of solo travel. I had double-checked my fuel, batteries for my satellite emergency beacon, made sure I had plenty of water, and I even thought about putting on new tires before I met a thoroughly grumpy hermit motorcycle mechanic who convinced me through his sheer unfriendliness not to change my tires after all. Luckily, the frequent summer storms had taken a break, and there was a big window of clear sky on the radar, which I could only hope would last a while. It was 100 miles to the Yukon River camp, where I could refuel and get a bite to eat. I settled in and carefully made my way north, with thoughts of bears and rogue truckers stuck in my head from all the online forums and blog posts, books and YouTube videos I'd devoured in the years before ever setting foot in this place. There were some decent stretches of pavement in this first section, although it was pretty irregular and potholed. You can see a lot of evidence of short-term repairs as the road flips back and forth between the paved and dirt sections. It had clearly rained the night before, so the dirt sections were a little greasy, but not too bad. I could see that if it really rained, the going would get a lot tougher. Here's one of those rogue truckers I'd heard so much about. I'd been warned of baseball-sized rocks being thrown through the air, kicked up by the trucks, meant for my face or some other vital part of the bike. So I obliged and I cautiously pulled over. As you can see, this trucker and all the others I met on the road were completely professional. They would slow down a bit, they'd give you some space, and they'd wave as they passed by. I learned that up here people tend to look out for one another because all you really have is each other when things get difficult. 100 miles in and we finally reached the famous Yukon River Bridge. I'd crossed this river several times on my way north, but this bridge was a true milestone. It also meant food and gas once I got to the other side. At this end of the bridge, you're 200 feet above the water and heading downhill at a 6% grade. Coming the other way was a fellow biker on an F800GS, returning from who knows where, maybe the Arctic Circle, maybe Coldfoot, maybe he made it to Deadhorse. No way to know, but seeing someone return, riding the same bike that I was on, really settled my nerves. I pulled into Yukon River Camp, glad to take a break and get something to eat. When I got off the bike, I was surprised by the lack of mosquitoes, but I was told the wildfires and heavy smoke had kept their numbers down this year. They have a nice little cafe staffed with really friendly people. I stuffed my face with a delicious salmon burger and I took a minute to get my bearings while looking at the map. In truth, it was a little easier to wrap my head around where I was by just standing on the shore of the river itself, the sky hazy with smoke, my mind clear and sharply focused. I topped up the tanks and I made my way back to the haul road. It was only a short 14 miles later that I was pulling into the parking lot at the Arctic Circle. From here on out, the sun would stay in the sky and never set. Getting to experience 24-hour daylight was a dream come true. Back on the road, there was some grading being done, which churned up the surface and made for some soft areas. They tend to spray water on the road as they do this, which makes for a few muddy sections, but the beauty of a motorcycle is you can pick your line and stay on the driest part of the road. The construction crews were just as friendly as the truckers, even if their job was to fix the road by making it momentarily tougher to navigate. Again, I keep my wheels on that strip of dry packed earth made by an earlier vehicle. One of the hazards of high speed and following trucks too closely is the dust storm, a frequent occurrence on the Dalton where you lose visibility, and depending on the wind direction, it can happen almost instantly. Rolling off the throttle and being patient is the key. Eventually you find a good moment to pass, and the truckers always seem happy to give you a little space. A little wave tends to go a long way up here. By this time you notice you are never far from the pipeline. It's a pretty constant companion as you wind your way toward Coldfoot. Speaking of Coldfoot, I'm arriving here now in late afternoon, about 260 miles from my starting point in Fairbanks this morning. I actually rode a few miles past Coldfoot to a campsite where accommodations were a princely $8. There were only one or two others camping that night, and I made sure to keep my bear spray close by. Coldfoot Camp is basically the midpoint of the route, and it sits in the start of the foothills of the massive Brooks Range. I went to camp for dinner, gassed up the bike, got a couple of stickers, and then made my way back to the tent in the eerie, smoky, perpetual twilight. Of course, the one time I leave my tent to air out under a clear sky, a random cloudburst soaks it while I'm away at dinner. This was the view from the tent at 3 a.m., sun shining right in my face. It was so great to experience that. Earlier that evening, I found a really dark great horned owl calling in this grove of trees. I slept well that night. In the morning, I packed up the tent with the help of a mosquito net and headed momentarily south to get breakfast before once again heading north, 240 miles to Deadhorse with no services in between. There's actually quite a lot of pavement just before and after Coldfoot, but it soon gives way to long gravel stretches that eventually reel in the mountains in the distance. The next big milestone was Adigan Pass, which sees you through onto the north side of the Brooks Range and the vast north slope. This hill was deceptive because it seemed like I was climbing over the mountains, only to be deposited onto a higher plateau. Here's the final climb toward the pass. It's a good idea to give descending trucks a wide berth, so I pulled over to let one pass before tackling the hill myself. Once heading up, I felt comfortable passing a truck that was crawling up in a low gear, and before I knew it, I'd reached the large parking area on the top of the pass. I can only imagine how serious these hill climbs are in the winter, or in rougher weather. Taking a break up here, I saw a raven perched on the front of a big rig. It was plucking dead insects off the grill. This was clearly a well-established behavior, as the bird soon moved on to the next truck that pulled in and plucked the insects off that grill as well. Descending on the north side of the pass was actually trickier than I expected. It's steeper than it looks, and the loose gravel shifts underneath your wheels. And when the road is off camber, it can kind of slip the bike to the left or right, unpredictably. And the bike shifted a couple of times under me and had me on my toes until I reached the bottom. Once through the pass, I could start finding my way to Deadhorse by following these mysterious, fast-moving balls of dust. The stories of trucks throwing stones aren't all made up. Luckily, this stone just bounced away harmlessly. Once you're clear of the foothills and properly on the north slope, the trees disappear and the tundra stretches out for miles. It's a gradual descent to the Arctic Ocean and to the literal end of the road. As always, the pipeline is there too, urging you further and further and further north. Eventually I did get to Deadhorse, or Prudhoe Bay, which is the proper name for the place. I almost crashed in some thick mud that was mixed up by the road construction, but I was relieved when the mud lasted for only about half a mile and I managed to make it through without dropping the bike. Things definitely got busier when I got close to town. With 24 hours of daylight, there's endless activity up here. I was careful to stay out of the way of the oil workers and construction crews. On the left, you can see the damage done to the permafrost by flooding earlier in the year. This part of the road was actually diverted. It was nearly 70 degrees, which is unusually warm for Deadhorse, even in the height of summer. Eventually, I arrived at the first major intersection in 240 miles. It looked out over Lake Colleen. I veered left and then realized I had no idea where the hotel was. So a quick stop to get my bearings, and I headed back in the other direction, soon to arrive at my home for the night, the Aurora Hotel. I'm not sure what the problem with my front wheel was, but at this point, my bike was basically my life, so I was probably justifiably cautious in giving it a second glance. The rear tire was holding up well, and the bike didn't look bad, as I'd had such good weather on the trip up. The trip reader read 241.5 miles since Coldfoot, and I had at least another 50 in the tank, plus an extra gallon strapped to the bike for good measure. This was the sight that greeted me when I walked into the main door of the hotel. Clearly not an ideal place for camping. After getting settled, I went out and found the famous sign at the general store and finally got the picture I'd been wanting for years. The windscreen of my bike had been signed by some of my motorcycling heroes, and their words were with me throughout the trip. Thanks to Ted Simon, Lois Price, Austin Vince, and others for the inspiration. And again to Austin for the custom Mondo overalls. The GPS on my phone provided a stark reminder of just exactly where I was on the planet. I had been on a mission to get here, and I felt a deep sense of relief. But now I also felt the looming responsibility of getting back home safely. Here's a creature that has no qualms about traveling great distances. It's the first snow bunting I ever saw, playing around on the big rigs outside of the hotel. One of the things I brought with me from home was this pebble from the shore of Lake Michigan. My plan was to exchange it from one from the Arctic Ocean and return the new stone to Lake Michigan when I got home. The next morning, I had my chance. I had booked a seat on the shuttle that takes you through the restricted area up to the ocean access point. After over 5,000 miles on the bike, I was finally at the Arctic Ocean. I traded stones and walked into the icy, peat-filled water to celebrate finally reaching my goal. Our guide pointed out this recent polar bear track in the sand about 50 feet away. I'd come a long way, and I had a lot to think about. Today was my anniversary. I was turning 42 in a couple of days, and I was starting a new teaching position in the fall. But the main thing on my mind was getting back home in one piece. As I said before, my mission now is to get home safely. Most people who die on Mount Everest end up dying on their way down the mountain. With unpredictable weather and road conditions on the Dalton, the way back would take just as much concentration as the road north, perhaps even more, as now I was starting to feel the impact of the previous 5,000 miles of riding, knowing that I probably had another 6,000 miles ahead of me. It was a cool, overcast day, and the north slope stretched on and on as I waited for some sign of the mountains ahead to appear. The truckers kept on trucking, and the road conditions were even better than the day before, though it still took a lot of concentration not to get caught out by patches of loose gravel, strong crosswinds, and wet patches. Gradually, the sun burned off the low clouds, and it ended up being a beautiful day of riding. This newly graveled section was like riding on marbles, and the strong crosswind felt like it was going to slide me right off the road. One of the rarest things you'll see on the Dalton is somebody out for a stroll. I stopped to chat with this guy for a while, and it turned out he was actually scouting for a construction crew. Finally, the foothills appeared ahead, and me and the pipeline made our way back toward the Adigan Pass in the land of trees. I mentioned that the mosquitoes on the southern end of the Dalton were light because of the fires. On the north side of the Brooks Range, it was an entirely different story. Smoke didn't make it this far north, and the mosquitoes were here in their normal numbers. I thought I'd take a break and give you a sense of what it's like everywhere up here in early July. When I reached the pass, the weather was still great, and I made it up the mountain with no problem. It's definitely steeper than it looks on film. A quick stop for some photos, and it was time to keep moving. This is the actual top of the pass, and I waited for a truck to make it up before heading down the south side. There are signs everywhere warning you not to stop because of the threat of avalanche, though it's not really an issue during the very short summers. The trees are gradually starting to return, and the road gets paved again as you approach Coldfoot Camp. Back at camp, I tried to keep myself in shape, while also discovering that as much as I wanted to enjoy this pursuit, I'm just not a pipe type of guy. Day 4. I refueled and I got back on the road with Fairbanks as my goal. The roads south of Coldfoot are much worse but still manageable. The smoky haze appeared and the trees grew ever taller as I approached the Arctic Circle once again. This is a long, long road. Back at Yukon River Camp, I gassed up again and prepared for the last 100 miles of the Dalton Highway. This little warbler was doing the same thing that the ravens at Adigan Pass did. It was finding an easy meal by picking dead bugs off the front of my bike. It had to fly, and so did I. At this point, I was just trying to soak up the experience, not knowing if I would ever have a chance to come back here again. I was lucky to have such ideal road conditions and great weather. Eventually, I came to the end of the 840-mile Dalton Highway round trip. No calamities, no breakdowns, just an incredible experience that I will never, ever forget. I suppose freak blizzards or tire repairs while fending off grizzly bears would have made for an amazing story. Me, I'm just fine with it being pretty straightforward. It meant I could meet my wife in time for an anniversary celebration in Anchorage before tackling the rest of the adventure of getting home again.